right. Welcome to the to Casey Stat, July 17th, 2018. Today's meeting is on the topic of housing, which we last met on in January. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump right into it. The goal for housing that was reaffirmed in last year's plan to sustain the city's diverse housing for all income groups through strategic planning and well-designed developments with an emphasis on revitalizing aging neighborhoods. And under that goal, there are a total of 3 objectives. The first one is about supporting rehab and construction of housing, and several strategies under that we'll be going through one by one. The next one is increasing accessibility to socially and physically diverse quality housing. And the final one is about improving the conditions and livability of housing throughout the city. So across these objectives, we have a few high-level metrics, and we're going to delve into each of these a little bit more throughout the presentation. We'll also probably be looking at how to establish new high-level metrics for this housing goal, since a lot of work's been done over the last year or two, and probably worth reflecting that in the metrics that we select. So. Other point that's sort of unique to the housing goal is that kind of overlaying everything we're going to talk about today is this housing policy plan that's underway. And so you may hear references to that. But we thought it was worth just updating the timeline up front of where this process is at. So the last time we met, staff was beginning to convene a group of stakeholders and pull together a facilitator, a plan for public outreach to inform a discussion around a housing policy with a plan to report out to council in August. And the plan is still to report out to council in August, and we're on our way. But since January, that stakeholder committee has been convened with both staff, most of the staff you see around this table, as well as a number of external stakeholders. We did develop a housing survey that was administered to a random sample, which you're going to be seeing some of that data today. And then I think probably most importantly, we did 6 public feedback sessions in addition to a couple of forums for kind of special interest stakeholders, and gleaned a lot of different insights from that. From those feedback sessions. So basically all of that feedback and the data is being pulled together and reviewed by the stakeholder group and distilled into a set of kind of policy insights and recommendations, and that's what will be coming out later this summer. So that's the big picture. Anybody here want to add anything to that overview? Okay. So we'll go right into Objective 1, which is around rehabilitation and construction of housing. And Strategy A is to perform targeted housing condition surveys to define or refine improvement activities. So I'll turn it over to City Planning for that.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning. Jeff Williams, City Planning and Development. It's been a goal for a while now for the city to come up with a strategy on how to perform a housing condition survey. Within the last 6 months, we as a department have had access to some technology that we're beginning to test out to understand how efficiently we can perform survey work. The map that you're seeing on the screen is showing 3 different geographies. The larger one is the Central City sales tax geography, and lots of our conversation with that board was having good baseline condition understanding of the area of the district, and to understand that as dollars flow from that initiative, how they are benefiting the community. The other you're seeing is the Heart of the City TIF, the proactive TIF that was established around the Board of Education's move to the Truce Corridor. Again, the idea of having good baseline data to be able to measure improvement that's being made. The geography you see in the map, that's kind of the tighter one that looks like it's literally outlining blocks. That is the Santa Fe community, and that's where we've first started to test some of the drive cam technology. It's cameras mounted to vehicles that can go and take pictures of properties, and then along with the photo survey, there's the ability to be able to capture some very general information about property condition. Santa Fe was chosen for a number of reasons. We've been working with the Kansas City Design Center to do some in-depth analysis about infill opportunities in both Santa Fe, which runs roughly 27th Street to 31st Street, Prospect over to Indiana. I'm also working with Key Coalition, the other side of Prospect. But that was chosen because we have some good baseline data, because it's a historic community, because we have other initiatives going on that was taking a look at infill development opportunities. So we've just begun our work. We're assembling as a group later this month to understand how the technology use was tied to how much staff time we put to this, to see what information we could glean, how we overlay it with other data sources, to begin to do a snapshot of condition. And based upon that pilot area, we'll be able to project how much additional staff time it might be, what cost, what other departments would be really helpful in terms of doing some of this survey work.
Okay, great. So moving on, the next strategy is around the establishment of a new local housing financing mechanism to support single-family rehab and infill construction. And for that, I believe John Wood is going to talk about the progress on this objective.
So as we all know that the rehabilitation has been one of the key areas that we've had a gap in the marketplace for the last several years since we've come out of the economic recession. And so one of the tools that we've universally heard across the community has been the lack of rehabilitation a tool for single-family homes. So for the last 18 months or so, we've been in a number of conversations with a number of banks to create a rehabilitation loan product. And the model that we are currently working with is the one that you see as an example. We're looking at an all-in cost of $43,000. The acquisition cost $3,000 is pretty typical, as we've seen in our land bank and our homesteading, the offers that we're receiving from individuals wanting to purchase a home. The rehabilitation cost is an example of $40,000, and that's where you get your $43,000 all in. Even with that, however, the appraised value of property after appraised rehab value is going to be less than what it costs to acquire and rehab. So we're hypothetically looking at about a $35,000 value to the house itself. From that, the financing is developed, and so we are anticipating that the borrowers would pay 3% down payment. That's what's being advocated now in our conversation with the banks. 3% down payment on the all-in cost, $1,300 in this example. The banks would loan 97% loan to value of the, again, based on the after rehab value, $33,950, and then a gap financing is where the city would come in with the subordinated mortgage of $77.50 to pay the difference between the appraised value and all-in cost. And that's the example we're working on right now with the banks. And that seems to be the direction we're moving in. In addition to the financing piece, there would be home buyer education and counseling, of course, and then we're working with staff on strengthening our contractor participation process. We've done that before. We're currently doing it with our Manor Home Repair, and it would be an expansion of that effort to incorporate the contractors to help with the rehabilitation piece. Then also the other thing, the program, we are talking about targeting our program into certain neighborhood areas, low-mod areas, and that is, again, one of the things that the banks have promoted and advocated for, and that would fall hand in hand with the process and strategy that we're currently undertaking with our CDBG program. And in terms of our next steps, again, we are, I would say, fairly close now with the banks. There have been a couple of other banks that have expressed interest in the program, and so we're incorporating, having one-on-one meetings with each of the banks to finally to go through any final issues that they may have with the program and the participation. So we're going through that process right now with LISC and the city. In the individual bank, we do expect that we'll have the RFP that we're submitting into the marketplace to find a loan service or originator. That's ready to go. We've been working now currently with our procurement office, and they've done the work that needs to be done on that with our law department, and we're about ready to finally put that out on the street. That probably will be about a 60-day opportunity for proposals to make a proposal to that RFP, and then we'll be evaluating that and hopefully make a selection for someone who can actually do originations and service these loans. And the goal is still to have this done by the end of this year. Any questions?
Nope.
Okay, so John mentioned the concept of targeting, and so the market value analysis is an important analysis that was completed about a year and a half ago to help us achieve a better understanding of our residential housing market and neighborhoods. And the strategy around this is to continue to integrate the results of this into housing and economic development strategies. So our city planning and development is going to talk a little bit about their use, and then I'm going to talk about the MVA as it relates to the housing survey. So,
Thanks, Kate. Again, this is looking at a specific geography, and so a few moments ago we talked about the Santa Fe neighborhood. So this map is really a close-up on that neighborhood, looking at the market value analysis map, and Kate talked about the 9 different categories that talk about residential market strength. So this geography is slightly different. We're here 27th down to Linwood Boulevard, again, Paseo, over to Indiana. So you're seeing within that area that I think identifies and feels as though it is truly one neighborhood, but you can see within that neighborhood there are different residential markets within the area. So it's important to understand a community and what different submarkets there are, understanding that community and its economics related to housing compared citywide. And the data that comes out of MBA talking about percentage of owner occupancy, understanding the amount of properties with property violations, properties that are bank owned, that data combined with the drive cam and the visual survey piece starts to pull together information that allows us to put together some specific strategies and appropriate interventions in the community, assistance for rehabilitation, opportunities for infill reinvestment, understanding what support would be needed from a perspective of market value and assessment versus cost to have homes constructed within the area. So it's really layering all this data and information to come out with strategies that are applicable to an area. But the great thing about MVA is because these different categories are across the entirety of a city, we're looking at a community that's kind of a combination of GH and I categories. There are other GH and I categories and combined areas across the city, and so techniques that are developed here in this area are high likelihood of being successful if they're applied in similar geographies across the city. So that's really why having the data to help shape community interventions is essential, because it then gives you a sense of the level of success as that gets rolled out to other communities.
Cool.
so the MVA itself is it's a measure of or an index that it tells us something about the places in the city. So it's a neighborhood-based assessment of place. It doesn't in and of itself tell us anything about the people who live in those places. And so we had an opportunity, I think, to understand those perspectives a little better with the housing survey that was performed as part of this housing policy process. So again, a survey on housing preferences, needs, and experiences was developed by the staff stakeholder group and then administered by our survey contractor to over 1,400 residents ended up taking it, spread throughout the city. And so again, it's going to be an important input into the housing policy, but for this set of upcoming charts, I'm just going to talk about it as it relates to the market value analysis. So this is literally taking those results and overlaying them with the market value analysis areas, which kind of allows us to say, okay, we know what these areas kind of look like on the ground. We have a sense of what, GHI looks like, or CD, et cetera. But what do the people who live in those types of areas, what are their feelings about housing? So kind of first off, I guess the most umbrella kind of perspective is how do people living in different areas feel about the importance of a housing policy? And so two things I would emphasize here. One is that really across the board, across all market value analysis areas, there's a strong rating of housing policies being very important or important. Those are the two, dark blue and kind of teal colored. So it's 80% or more across the categories. But if you parse that a little bit and look at very important as opposed to as compared to important, you can see in the yellow MVA areas there's a a higher rating of very important. So the residents living in that area is really,
Where are the yellow MBA areas?
that's the GH and I.
On the previous map?
Yeah, so I probably should have put something in here that was an overview of the MVA.
Yeah, because where's A, B, and the rest of them?
So, do we want to just pull? Yeah, you want to pull up the actual MVA. So, brief kind of review of MVA is that it gave us an understanding of the spectrum of our strength of our residential housing markets from A and B, purple markets being the strongest, then I think it's like you might just need to search for it because it's kind of a long. So A and B, purple being the strongest markets, C and D being kind of mid markets or a little above mid market, E and F being kind of right below mid market, and then GH and I being the most distressed. Yeah, that's it. So if you want to actually, there's the map, but then there's also, and this is on the city's website. Yeah.
Thank you, because
New
this is
website.
not the commercial we
Yeah.
want.
So there's both a chart that shows kind of the layout of those, or the spectrum of those A all the way to I. So you can see basically what this shows is that median sales price in these markets declines from A to I. And then metrics like distressed sales, vacant homes, increases pretty substantially. By the time you get to the yellow markets, you're at, greater than 25% distressed sales, 25% vacant homes, and then homes with violations, that also increases. And then permit activity, sort of a opposite metric, declines. So you have the most permit activity in the stronger markets. And then there's a few other kind of complementary markets that are metrics in there, but this is what the map looks like. Essentially, you have north of the river, largely in the newer areas, you have purple markets kind of surrounded by some blue. So those are, again, all very strong to strong residential housing markets. Immediately north, you have kind of those green mid-markets, first ring suburb areas. And then as you go south, again, you have the purple and blue on the west side of the city, a big concentration of the purple in that Country Club Plaza, Ward Parkway corridor area, distressed markets, kind of what we would expect. But, you see the patchwork there of G to I, so kind of showing that the level of distress actually does vary quite a bit from neighborhood to neighborhood. And then south of that, you have, again, a collection of E and F. And then, further south into the east, you've got some more purple and blue. So, the thing this shows us is both the level of variance, but also it's in a fairly small geographic area, the census block group, and so you can actually see it's almost like a patchwork quilt of, and a lot of these areas really are side by side with each other, which is pretty striking. So you see blue and even kind of purple areas side by side with G areas kind of along the Truce corridor, or actually as you get a little further north, that line goes a little bit further east. And so you see like Beacon Hill is actually, I believe, a blue area.
And again, it's just the interest you have different categories existing within one neighborhood. I think there's also an interesting commercial as we look at the categories. This data has been in effect for about 2 years now. And I think we can all agree it's been a very robust housing market for the last 2 years. So this may be a really early pitch, but one of the things we would like to see happen, all of us would like to see happen, is refreshing this data. Communities to get the most benefit out of having an MVA are those that refresh this data on a 2 to 3 year period, because my suspicion, I think in some areas, categories will shift and change just because we've seen tightening housing markets or people exploring housing alternatives.
There you go. You've got your foot wrapped around a cord. I didn't want you to hang your toes or anything.
So I'll go ahead and pull up the map over on this other screen so we can kind of have it up as we go through the slides. So again, going back to this concept, in those yellow markets, the most distressed markets, you see that 60% of residents there say that it's very important for the city to focus on developing housing policy and investing in housing programs. So probably reflecting their reality that they feel that this is an area that really needs some attention. Going on, another question that we asked about on the housing survey is about sort of deferred maintenance, either as a homeowner, do you have areas of, that maintenance issues that you can't afford to resolve, or if you live in a rental unit, are there maintenance issues that your landlord has not resolved? And so both in homeowners, which is the chart to the left, and rental units, which is the chart to the right, that issue of deferred maintenance increases as the kind of level of distress increases. So, for homeowners in particular, GH&I 59% and greater homeowners say that they have unresolved maintenance issues, which certainly relates back to programs like minor home repair that we both have and potentially would look at focusing on more with an upcoming housing policy. So, and not just sort of quality of housing issues, but that ability to afford the housing that you're in is also related to market strength, probably not surprisingly. So this is, again, showing the 4 groupings of housing, and then we asked residents about different actions they've taken during the last 3 years because they were struggling to pay their rent or mortgage. And all of these actions, so it's adding hours or jobs, accumulating credit card debt, stop saving for retirement, cut back on healthy food, cut back on health care. They all increase as you move from the purple markets to the yellow. I thought that they all sort of increase proportionally, which makes sense because there are more low income people living in the more distressed markets. But you see a couple of them really jump, namely the cutting back on healthy food and cutting back on health care, that those are really things that are occurring much more often in the GH&I markets and E&F to some extent, much proportionally a lot more than in the higher income markets. So certainly an insight that I think is important and kind of concerning. So we also asked about interest in homeownership.
Can I ask a question, though? How do you control for that? There's a lot of reasons why people would cut back on food and health care, and I guess I'm kind of looking for a baseline. How do we know they were getting, I don't know. It seems like kind of a mushy question without.
So, we specifically said, have you taken any of the following actions because you were struggling to pay your rent or mortgage? So, you're right. It could be that concept of struggling to pay your rent or mortgage is sort of relative. But I will say there were a whole list of options there, these 5, and then there were a couple of others that were not as common for people to select. But in the yellow markets, 44% of people overall said they'd taken at least one of those actions. And then that really declines as you get to the stronger markets.
Yeah, part of the issue, a rent or mortgage is a fixed cost. You're locked in for 30 years or a year if you're paying rent. So, what can you do to mitigate that? So obviously these are, even in the purple A and B, it's people are taking actions because they're over their heads. Either the company that they're working for, as we see, has been cutting back on, a lot of companies have been cutting back on health care costs and benefits and whatnot, and people are now having to cover their own cost other ways.
Got it.
Yeah, and I think that this question sort of assumes that your rent or mortgage is going to be your first priority, one of your first priorities for payment, and so, yeah.
Yeah.
So we did also ask a question about interest in homeownership, because I think that's something that we have a very good understanding of where we have more rental versus homeowners, but not necessarily as much of an understanding of the interest in becoming a homeowner. And so you can see that there is a strong interest. This chart actually shows the gray is in each area the percent that are already said that they already were a homeowner on the survey, and so not relevant to them. But among the renter group, from the F, G, H, and I, about half of them in each said that they were interested in becoming a homeowner. So the yellow would be the proportion of renters that were not, or the proportion of residents that were not, and the blue is the proportion that were. So a lot of opportunity here. And Jeff's actually going to speak a little bit to housing supply and demand, I think an issue that relates to this. And then in the C markets, you also see a large proportion of people who say that they'd like to become homeowners. And that relates to, in the C markets, we just have a lot more rental property than in some of the surrounding ones. So, important footnote to wanting to become homeowners is that, the majority of those people who do want to become a homeowner face barriers of some kind in seeking home ownership. And so we went into a little bit more detail. It's not shown here, but we asked them what types of barriers. The most common barriers across the board were access to a down payment and then credit history issues. So sort of, again, validated that issue. But there are many people across all of our markets, particularly in the distressed markets, that are interested in home ownership, and they do have challenges in meeting that goal, and possibly something that a program or policy could help to address.
And I would say that another barrier that tends to, you don't hear a lot about is just lack of knowledge. People don't know how to start to become a homeowner. It's a daunting task for them to become a homeowner, and that process stops a lot of people from moving forward.
What you ought to do is get yourself a video camera, have communications do one of those late night infomercials. We'll put you on channel 2. And, you can yeah, you can sell some knives too if you call right now.
We have Chris Hernandez. He can do that for us. He's a trained.
He can't pull it off the way that you can.
Okay, all right. Oh, you want me to do it?
Yeah. I mean, I know, I've seen Chris on TV. I'm dying to see what you would do.
I would probably be dying too.
So I think the last chart I have in here from the housing survey relating to the MVA is kind of in contrast. So a lot of
Did you put these colors up here because Queer Eye's in town?
no, but it is a nice celebration. It's very very colorful. That's I was excited to make a chart where I could actually use the MVA colors in the chart, but. So this one, a lot of the MVA, when we talk about the data around it, or even in this housing survey, we are drawing distinctions between these different areas and talking about how different they are. But I thought it was important to point out that another question we asked was, we gave residents a list of factors and said, how important are these factors to you in selecting housing? And when you look at the top factors across the board, there's actually very little difference across markets in terms of people rating them as important or very important. So bottom line, across all different types of housing markets, everyone is concerned about affordability. Everyone is concerned about their neighborhood being safe. Everyone is concerned about their house being in good condition. Energy efficiency is important, across the board. In fact, it looks like it's actually a little more important relative in those more distressed markets. So maybe understanding the impact of those costs. So I just thought, good emphasis that, these places may look very different, but the people living within them have very similar goals and, very similar concerns for their housing and possibly could be addressed by a integrated housing policy. So if there's no questions about the MVA or those housing survey questions, we can actually move to objective 2.
Okay, so now that you've got all those questions and the surveys, what are you going to do with the information? What's the value of the information?
So the housing survey was put together to help answer questions that we had about policy issues. So, that question about what's the interest in home ownership, I think is a good example of one. Understanding what that is, understanding how people rate their conditions of their housing. Their self-rate, but still understanding how they're rating the conditions of their housing, understanding what their experiences are, how financially stable they feel in their housing. So there's lots of different policy ideas that I think have been floated, none of which are really that well crystallized yet, but we tried to design the survey to directly relate to some of the policy ideas that have been suggested.
I think those things, Kate, that are just universal mandates, those things things that everybody is looking for in their housing experience here, regardless of geography. And I think it's some data that does help us be a bit more geographic specific about looking at the housing stock that is in place and looking at the appropriate tools to provide for the rehabilitation of that housing stock, to provide an affordable housing need, or to broaden overall market interest. So I think that's where the survey work is really very helpful. I think lots of things that people might make assumptions about why people are selecting neighborhoods or housing, I think this survey somewhat helped us get a sense of how people are prioritizing issues related to housing. Everything from, Kate might expand the list about access to transit, access to education, access to jobs, things of that nature. And it was really very interesting where the survey helped to indicate those things were universal, and it helped to make sure that as we're setting policy, we're going after satisfying the right characteristics people are looking for as they make their housing decisions.
Yeah, and I think as we try sort of to summarize it is the housing survey is capturing sort of housing experiences. So, have you had a forced move? Are you struggling to pay your rent or mortgage? Have you had issues with condition? Housing needs, so, things relating to those things I just mentioned. And then housing preferences, too, which is actually another area that we really don't have a lot of great information about why people choose that. We have a lot of ideas, but not a lot of validated information. And so I think there's also an idea that this data could be a good input into conversations with developers to help understand, what is the relative importance of things like transit or diversity in neighborhood. And we can, again, as Jeff said, we can look at that geographically. We can kind of slice and dice this a lot of different ways. We could say, what are younger generations prefer as opposed to older generations? So I think it can inform the policy discussion, but also can be something that can kind of inform discussions about development more broadly and help give some support to areas that are already areas of focus, or maybe even switch. So, one of the things that we had, again, it was a list of about 14 or 15 factors that we brainstormed that could, we thought any of these seemed like they could influence or, be a factor in choosing housing. I actually thought maybe all of them would come back as like everybody rated all of them as important. I had no idea. So you saw the ones that were the top where almost everybody rated them as important. As you go down the list, it starts to break off quite a bit where some of the factors are only important to like 40% of residents.
Such as?
Education
education,
Education
yeah.
was very low on
It was low relative to a lot of the other factors, which is it's something that's discussed a lot.
surprised.
Did you look at that did you look at that with the fair housing, or look at the education issue as it relates to the market value analysis?
Yeah, I think I did, and I think it's, I think it's relatively, maybe I looked at it with regard to geography. There wasn't a huge amount of difference. I think the thing that explains that education being further down the list is that while it is very important to many people, the percent of our population that with very young children or planning to have young children that's trying to find an education solution is only a portion. We have a lot of people in our city who are not wrestling with education as an issue because their children are grown or because they don't have children or because they're younger. So that's it's not to say it's not important to the people it is important to. It's just when you look across our whole population and housing needs, it's not at the top for across the board. So you'll definitely see this data kind of entering into the conversation quite a bit more, I think. So we will move on to objective 2, which is to increase accessibility to socially and physically diverse quality housing throughout the city for all income groups. And the first strategy here is ensure that implementation of annual action plans meet affirmatively furthering fair housing goals. And so I'll turn it over to Stuart Bullington to talk about this.
Thanks, Kate. Stuart Bullington, Deputy Director of Neighborhoods and Housing Services. This is a timely presentation. We are right at the point of submitting our annual performance report to HUD, which summarizes everything that we've done with our 4 entitlement funds, the CDBG, Home Emergency Solutions Grant, and HOPWA, which is Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS in partnership with the Health Department. What you see here is expenditure totals, 8.7 for Community Development Block Grant, 3.8 million for Home. ESG is 761,000. I might note that all of these are in above what we receive from the federal government. So it shows kind of the cycle of how some of these projects roll out. It takes about a 2-year cycle for some of our large multifamily projects, our public facility projects, because there's lots of other funding that has to come together in order to make those work. So this is just a snapshot of those totals. The next slide breaks it down by category across the board. As you can see, there's a range of things that we do. I want to point out that this is not easy work to spend $1 from the federal government. It takes a lot of planning, of course, in the fall, contracts in the spring, council review in January, February. So it's quite a process, and it goes on all year long. This is what we've done. Like I said, in the performance report, which is on our webpage, it also breaks it down by demographics and exactly who we served, children, elderly, et cetera. So. One of the things that is challenging that we're kind of moving, the projects that we've done right now with low-income housing tax credits, I did a presentation to the chamber here a couple weeks ago, and out of 4 projects, it was across the board a gap of about $1.5 million. So you would not see some of the projects that are underway right now, like Blenheim School, Morningstar Senior Project, Faxon School would not have been done. Mayor of the Colonnades is renting up last week. So,
Really?
And that would have been a stalled project as well without those state tax credits. So I
we
want to
talking about
point
the
out
same
that that is
Colonnades?
something that we're continuing to watch. Hopefully, it'll get back on track in the fall, and we'll have the full support of the state once again. So,
It
Well-
is the same colonnades.
Well, I know that the governor's talking about appointing some sort of commission again to look at housing tax credits. I think we may have an opportunity to at least influence him to the extent that they hear from us loud and clear, as opposed to a 350-person town in mid-Missouri that doesn't use them, like the last fiasco. I think the governor's going to be in town on, thinking it might be August 2 for a day. I want to make sure that we show him what we've done with our low-income housing tax credits. He's here to see our problems. This is a problem. So I would be most interested in your ideas. We won't have a tremendous amount of time, but I'd like to have at least 1 or 2 places where we can show. And I don't know if we have any before and afters, photographs of any places. If we do, I'd sure like to see them. Because we're only going to get this shot once. I want to take it. Okay?
the many of the befores are vacant lots, vacant ground. Like Blenheim School's a vacant school that's been boarded up for years. Faxon School, et cetera, have had essentially a blighting influence on neighborhoods. So, you know, without the state tax credits, I'm reminded of that old game Sim City, where a lot of things go black if you don't
There's nothing
build.
wrong with going black, man. Once you go black, you never go back.
I know. As soon as I said that, I knew I was in trouble. But I was never good at that game because I always, my cities all kind of crumbled. But it's important to build and fix up. That's, in our case, the River Market, Quality Hill, a lot of downtown, up and down the Paseo corridor. You know, those projects would not have happened without this partnership, so.
Okay, thanks. Well, I want to make sure that we take advantage of the time that we have with him to make sure that we make a point about this.
Correct.
Because it's easy to eliminate things in the abstract. But when you actually see what the results of using those credits are, I hope it will give him pause and some understanding of the need, not just here. I think Mayor Cruzen will be with us when we're doing this, and then I'll get to see what's going on in St. Louis at some point in time in the future as well. So we'll see how that works out. I'll give you as much notice as I can so that we can make sure that we have something that, and I'd like to do something, I'd like to be able to put something in his hands that he can actually take away. Nothing huge, just something that will remind him he was here.
We've done other tours where we're just gonna put together a tour map and some quick highlights and some projects, and we see how far we get.
Fantastic, yeah. We'll be touring a lot of different stuff. Housing will just be one, okay?
Jennifer, do you want to talk about housing trust funds a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been exploring in our housing policy discussion over the last 3 or 4 months is new revenue sources for housing. And so we have put together just an overview of what some of the other cities are doing in terms of revenue sources. And these are some of our peer cities like Denver. They're doing impact fees for developers and property tax. Some of the cities are using bonding. But the large amount of folks are using some type of property tax or use tax. Nashville is using an Airbnb tax, which is kind of interesting. But most of these cities have all decided that they're going to create this fund that will help fill the gap that Stuart is talking about in terms of our light tech properties, or if we want to do some mixed income type properties, that there would be some funds that basically would fill that gap.
Do we have any idea of how big these funds are in these cities? I mean, are we talking about $1 million or $50 million?
So they range from $3 to $4 million to almost $100 million in some of the bigger cities. Especially the cities that are doing bond funding. Those funds are pretty substantial, and they have a targeted area that they have identified and projects they have identified to actually do that bond funding across that targeted area. So those can be fairly large bonding issues. But $10 to $20 million are probably the most of them, but some of them are very substantial.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so strategies B and D both deal with affordability in one form or another. So strategy B is about creation and retention of housing units at all levels of affordability and emphasizing mixed income housing. Strategy D is about workforce housing units, which is sort of a subset of that, all levels of affordability. So in the interest of not confusing the conversation, we've sort of put all of the slides addressing both of these in the same grouping. And so again, bringing back to the housing survey, and this is actually that full list of factors that I was talking about. Affordability, as I previously mentioned, is important to everyone. And so I think when we devised this strategy, we didn't have this data in front of us, but that idea of focusing on affordability at all levels of the market, I think is upheld in terms of what people's preferences are, what they're looking for from housing. Any questions on that slide? Because I know I just referenced it, and before we move on to the cost burden.
I don't have any. I'm
Okay.
a little surprised by some of the rankings.
Yeah, and I should say, and can certainly go into more detail of this in the future, again, those top factors are very important to almost everyone, regardless of sort of income or where they live or the neighborhood, the market kind of the condition of their neighborhood. As you go down the list, there starts to be a substantial amount of difference between like either different geographies or, other demographic factors. So, what may be important to sort of the center of the city may be less important in the newer suburban areas, or vice versa. People have sort of expressed the preferences that they're already living, if that makes sense.
Kate, question on that. Did we gather data on whether they have children or not, or at what age, so we could actually look at the subset to see how they value education versus those that don't?
Yeah, we've got, do you have children? And we also asked a question about, are there seniors living in the home? So both ends of the spectrum and kind of understand what the preferences are. That's a
So
good thought.
when we're asking the ones, do you have children, do the rankings change?
I don't think I've done that, but we can look into that and see. I would guess that they do. I think that's a fair.
Probably, yeah.
Certainly things like close to childcare as well. Like that's not relevant for anybody who doesn't have kids. But okay, so moving on to talking about cost burden. These are actually so this is again just data that talks about relative levels of affordability in Kansas City, and so these are actually slides that were shown at the public feedback sessions to kind of try to frame this issue of affordability. So a common metric for affordability is 30% of your household income on rent or mortgage as a threshold. If you're over that, tend to be considered cost burden. That's sort of a national definition. So you can certainly poke at it and say it's not relevant. I think, as we'll talk about a little later on too, it doesn't always include all housing costs like utilities, and that's where it starts to get maybe kind of unrealistic. Or transportation costs is another one that if you pile on to that, it could start to climb. Even if you're technically under 30% for your rent or mortgage, if you have to pay a lot for transportation or a lot for utilities, your overall housing costs are up. So, but even just looking at that rent or mortgage metric, a little over a quarter of homeowners in the city spend over that threshold on their mortgage, and almost half of renters. So more renters relative are dealing with that. And then again, could go back to what John said, which is that mortgages can be a relatively more fixed cost over time unless you are in some sort of adjustable rate situation. But, for your mortgage, the cost isn't necessarily escalating over time in the same way that your rent probably is. And just the stat there to the right shows that this is very common across the U.S., this concept of cost burden.
Anecdotally, we hear that people are paying rent, in particular if they happen to be in single-family homes, they're paying $800,000, $1,200 a month. That example we talked about earlier on the rehab loan, the all-in cost of $43,000 I discussed earlier. A house like that in the urban core, someone would pay rent maybe $1,000 a month because that's what they're doing. But if you had a mortgage of $43,000 over 30 years, you're paying less than $300 a month, and it's yours.
So the next chart actually shows that, as it would make sense, that proportion that are cost burdened increases as income decreases. So in that lowest income group, virtually all renters are cost burdened, are paying more than that 30%, and the vast majority of owners as well. Really, even in that 20 to 35,000 range for households, you still have more than half of residents that are cost burdened, and then it declines until, our median income for the city is about 47,000, and so, when you get, we don't have a direct line in here, but when you get over that, you start to see, only 17% of owners, 9% of renters are cost burdened at that point, so. Seniors is a subset that gets discussed in some circles, probably worth a little bit of extra attention because not only is there a significant amount that are cost burdened, but it's actually kind of flipped from the norm for the population at large. So we talked about more renters are cost burdened on the whole. For seniors, it's more than half of homeowners are actually cost burdened. And again, you know, in that case, you do have maybe fixed housing costs, but, you know, maybe escalating property taxes, et cetera, and you earn a very fixed income. Whereas renters, I'm sort of surmising this, but I would think some of the renters represented in the senior group are already in some sort of subsidized housing situation, and so that might explain the lower proportion that are cost burdened there. But certainly a concern for both groups. And here you see both that 30 to 35, like 4%, and then 35% or more. So the cost burden just keeps on climbing. I mean, definitely you hear, you know, stories of people paying 50, 60% of their income on rent or mortgage. City Planning is going to talk a little bit more about effort around mixed income.
Yes, and I think the city's biggest push as relates to mixed income housing is our work with the Housing Authority and Bryn Chord Development around the Choice Neighborhood Grant, a $30 million grant we received almost 3 years ago now to look at redevelopment, specifically looking at the demolition of the Shoto Courts public housing development and recreating those units across a number of different mixed income housing developments. And that mixes typically a third public housing units, a third units that would be classified as affordable or assisted in some way, and a third market rate. The map you see on the screen is a map of the Paseo Gateway area. That's the target of the Choice Grant. And not only the Choice funding, but actually state funding was used on these projects that you are seeing here. So it's important to talk about state dollars being necessary even to help us further leverage federal dollars we receive for housing. But the buildings you're seeing there, all three of them are under construction at the same time. Fortunately, the developer received state tax credits for all three of those projects in the same round, and that's what's letting all those three developments happen. So Quinlan Row, individual townhouse type units, Quinlan Place, an apartment block, and then Arts Block, which is right on Independence Avenue.
That
will
might be
have
where
some-
I take the governor. It's an easy tour.
That,
What, the Arts Block?
No,
Oh, that, in the
Choice
north
area.
end?
all, if you look at
The
the
Choice area?
all three of
It's
those.
about a 4-block area. You can see
Right.
the public housing units that
Yeah.
are coming down, and then the new blocks.
Good idea.
And that would show the governor the leveraging capability.
That would be, that's a good idea.
That would be great. And then, so fortunately, we have construction happening all at the same time. All those units under construction are expected to be available spring of next year. But the other way to look at Choice Grant, because Choice is kind of the iteration of the Hope 6 initiative from HUD, which was talking about replacing housing units, but Choice is really talking about a wholesale neighborhood reinvestment. And so the next slide shows and talks about CCI, Critical Community Improvements. So a portion of the grant, $4.5 million, was tied to things that would be benefits for the community. So the Choice talks about a housing component, a people component, and a neighborhood component. So you're seeing on the screen a list of different initiatives, park rehabilitations, dollars for storefront improvements, looking at dollars to help homeowners with exterior improvements that we can couple with our dollars for home repair, streetscape improvements, investments at the Woodland School building, the community building, to turn on more of those spaces for public use, dollar potential acquisition. So the idea, it's not only about providing new housing options and alternatives in a mixed income environment, but it's also making sure that all that supportive infrastructure is there as a neighborhood strengthens and continues to grow. I mean, that, again, it's not only about the availability of housing, but what is the quality of neighborhood, and these CCI improvements help benefit existing property owners, existing renters, as well as providing additional amenities for someone who would be moving to the community. So CCI is our next push now. Housing coming out of the ground, and we'll be looking to implement these CCI projects.
When do we hear back from HUD on whether they approve this list or
We
not?
should hear back from them within, I'd say, the next 30 to 60 days. And again, it's a 5-year grant period, and then we have periods beyond to spend. But this is really the right time now. We've got new residents coming, so let's get our park improvements going, let's get our streetscape pieces done.
Let's get it done.
And it's also tying in with other funding commitments we've made and other dollars. The Paseo, Independence, intersection rebuild, that should be starting next year.
Next spring.
Will also be taking advantage of some of these dollars. So streetscape improvements could include putting cycle tracks in front of residential units we're building that tie into the cycle track facilities we make as part of those intersection improvements. So it's really trying to pull everything together and really be a holistic plan for community investment and revitalization.
Okay, cool.
And then also as it relates to, so that's talking about creating new mixed income housing, or replacing, I guess, existing housing with new mixed income housing. But then the ongoing issue of affordable housing preservation in the downtown area that's been discussed. Stuart, I don't know if you want to expand on this a little bit.
Yeah, this is an ongoing conversation about, what happens to expiring affordable housing units, basically low-income housing tax credits. We started this in early 1990s, and a lot of these projects, of course, expire, and then what? Do the developers raise the rents astronomical to meet the market, or do they maintain reasonable rents to keep the market that they have? And like I said, that's what we're looking at. And like I said, we're going to be strategizing in the policy about how to flex in affordable housing into some of these mixed income developments and what that exactly means from our side. It's a balancing act of putting more low-income housing tax credits in the downtown and pulling them away from areas of need, such as up and down the Prospect Corridor. So it's something that we need to look at. And it's the mix of funding sources that we're looking at, like I said, to use a trust fund to create mixed income housing downtown, or tax abatement, et cetera. It's all being considered, so. And this is just a slide of just exactly what I talked about. We have quite a few affordable housing units, and those will be expiring over the next, 4 or 5 years.
Have we done an analysis? I know that there's always a need for affordable work and workforce housing. Have we done a complete analysis to find out exactly what the needs are across the board? What's the need for more apartments? What's the need for high-end, low-end, whatever? Do we have a complete analysis of the housing needs?
Chart, my favorite chart.
I think actually the mayor's just 2 slides ahead of us, as always.
Thank you very much. You get a raise. Don't worry, it's coming out of John's salary. You guys can work it out.
I guess I better start talking.
So it was just literally understanding supply and demand and how do we get started. And to your point, across the entirety of the housing market. So this first slide is really talking about supply and demand from a rental housing perspective. So you're seeing, again, we always peg things, look at affordability at less than 30% of annual income and availability. But what the chart is showing is rental apartments, understand the rent levels, everything from below $125 a month all the way up to $37.50 and more. And then that's pegged to what an annual income would be if you're using that 30% figure for affordability, so less than $5,000 all the way up to $150,000 and more. Blue bars are units we have. The orange bars are what the demand is, and we're pulling a lot of this data just from our American Community Survey work and census. And so this is very baseline. We talked, there's a lot of other factors that go into this, but you're seeing that at the lower range of the market, clearly there's more demand than supply that we have. Middle sections, it kind of turns around the other way. We have what were perceived to be more units than there is demand. As you get to the higher end, you're looking at a situation where there would be more demand than there are units. But I think there's a ton of caveats on that about understanding, again, affordability, and it's not just rent, it's all those other factors that allow you to be at a location, transit, and utility burden, other types of cost. On the upper end, while it might seem as though it is a lack in terms of supply, people at the upper end have more means, and they certainly can move their way down into other types of housing circumstances or situations. So somebody who can afford $3,700 a month can also afford, I'll get to categories where we have more supply. They can put themselves down to $1,250. They have more choice. They have more options. So it's kind of hard to take a look at it purely just from the supply and demand perspective, but it does give you a sense and an understanding. I want to roll to the next slide.
Well, I think it's important, because I think the debate about affordability has always been about that 80% of median income, which suggests we've got maybe an adequate supply in that 80 to 100% of median income. Where we've got a supply problem appears to be on the very low income, the public housing, the very low income, those issues. And I think that's a different conversation than a strictly affordable issue. This is public housing or quasi-public
But
housing.
it is definitely looking at assisted housing in some way,
Right.
shape, or form. That's the feedback we've got even from the community meetings we've had on housing, and it's affordability, but even the asked broader community, there's been a lot of emphasis on understanding that we need to provide more housing options for people with the least amount of means to be able to afford housing. That's, if there was a takeaway from all of our sessions all across the board, that really has been it. I think now the question, understanding supply and demand, talks about, do we have existing housing resources we can put dollars in to make those units accessible? Is it just, we're just totally lacking inventory, and we need to just build things coming out of the ground? Those are I think the subtleties. Looking at more data will help us understand. Are there units that are sitting out there? And that's why I didn't mean to push to the next, but the next slide is the same data about home ownership. And we talked before that people, even with the lower levels of household income, still have a desire for some form of ownership. We have a high number, almost 3/4 of our housing stock really looks at single-family development. That's how the city is really, that's what it's really kind of built upon. And so everybody wants to participate in some way in an ownership stream. Here, looking at the data that, affordable ownership is less than 4 times your annual income. So that's where the data changes a little bit. So at a range of, let's say, $125 to $250 a month to be able to, at a range of a home of $20,000 to $40,000, it's requiring income of $5,000 to $10,000. There you're seeing, actually, it's kind of, look, there's a lot more supply than there is demand from the ownership perspective. But I think we've talked throughout the meeting today about lots of the barriers and challenges from an ownership perspective, whether it's awareness of opportunity, whether it's the ability to be able to afford the cost beyond your mortgage, transportation, utilities, et cetera, et cetera. So here's a case where there may indeed be demand, there may indeed be supply, but that it's challenging for folks to be able to get over all those barriers to be able to be owners. Again, looking at the upper end of the market, again, it's showing here that there is a good deal of demand and not necessarily the units. We are not in a case where, we talk about permit activity data. We're pretty active still. We're putting a lot of new housing online. Those costs are at a higher end. Some of it is just by the escalation of cost of construction, but really, again, there is a demand for housing product all throughout, but clearly at the upper ends of the market. And I think at the lower ends of the market, it really is understanding how we're going to have some form of intervention, because the market itself, and then there's another slide here that talks a little bit about naturally occurring affordable units. And
What's a naturally occurring affordable unit
those are
mean?
things that are not subsidized units for low and moderate income. So you're not bringing any form of housing subsidy to making that rent affordable. And Kate, I don't know if that
Yeah, I mean, you certainly covered it. I think the only thing I would add is, so as Jeff said, you look at this and the way it says on the slide too, is there's a surplus of units. You could also look at that as a deficit of people, and for many of the reasons we discussed with access to the market. The other thing I would caution in looking at this is that obviously this is just thinking about supply and demand in terms of cost. We certainly have to consider that while there may be a surplus of, or there may be availability of units at these lower levels levels that if someone could, get over the barrier they have, whether that's credit check or down payment or that sort of thing, that they could purchase, you do have to consider things like condition for sure. Some of these units that are at, $20,000 may not be at a condition that is preferable for people. And then other factors that are important to people like
Yeah,
safety.
Yeah, another factor that we're seeing, if I recall, Kate, is in MVA, we're seeing more owners buying up the single-family homes, and so they're now becoming rentals for them as opposed to being in the marketplace for people who may want to buy those and live in them. So that's a growing factor in our urban core. It is a big problem.
It's interesting. It's a little different than what I would have expected.
We've got a
quite
real
honest.
interesting, unique issue when we can get, I've really struggled with this whole affordable housing debate because you can buy property, you can buy a home for $45,000. Okay, so that's a very affordable home ownership. And you can buy real estate at that level. So how do you get people into there versus when you look at Denver, try to find a home in the city of Denver for less than $150,000.
Right.
They have an affordable housing crisis. Their real estate market is pricing beyond.
Were you looking for houses?
No,
in
I
Denver?
was in Denver and I was curious about it.
There's something that we need to know?
I was in Denver, I was curious about it, and I've got some family in Denver, and they struggle because of the growing property values, the rapidly growing property. They're getting priced out of the Denver market in terms of, we've got just the opposite. We've got
We have
too much of this
low cost,
housing on the low end of the spectrum where there's essentially no demand,
And so
and so you've got a crash in prices.
And it's barriers that are not barriers of the desired homeowner's perspective.
Right.
It's barriers from the lending community in that
Right.
even if somebody is able to qualify, they're looking at other comps in the area and it's not comping out, so people
Right.
don't have access to the funding to be able to do it, which makes us have to look at alternate forms of ownership potentially. And we're looking at whenever somebody is in the housing market, we're always trying to figure out some way for them to be in an ownership stream, even if it's in some type of a cooperative or condominium environment. Just start off building equity with their housing investments, their housing payments, and start working their way up the property ladder. That's the real challenge.
One of the things that was interesting about the Denver housing policy plan was that their median income for the Metro of Denver is only $3,000 higher than our median income for the Metro. Ours is $80,000, theirs is $83,000 for a family of four. And the cost of housing is much, much higher. So they are, a slide on cost burden in Denver would be quite
Exactly.
extreme.
It's a different affordable housing crisis in Denver than what we've got here. We've got to somehow make the connection between our supply, which we have plenty of supply,
Right.
and our demand, and how do we've got a market failure issue.
A lot of it is about the balance of choice and affordability, and in some markets, it totally pivots to just about being affordable. People are just making decisions because that's all they can afford. We have a market here that's like people clearly are making options and choices because of affordability, but we still have some room for there to be some level of choice at upper income levels. I will say that in lots of housing markets across this country, it is really all about just the raw affordability.
Right.
And Denver being one of those places,
Right.
Atlanta again, any place that.
Well, most cities, you look at that affordable housing crisis, it's just that the pricing out of the lower tier income folks. We don't have that issue. We've got a different issue.
And I think that's where your gentrification in those markets are a little bit more pronounced than it would be here in Kansas City.
Right.
So where mixed income housing strategies here, I think are very viable, and they get very challenged in other areas with this higher level of stress related to affordability. And we've talked a little bit again, but we talked about supply for extremely low income households and those things we were saying that are kind of naturally occurring units. We're located, Jackson County has about 23 naturally occurring affordable units for every 1,000 extremely low income individuals, so 23%. About 50% if you include subsidized units there. So again, having those conditions for naturally occurring units can be challenging, and then understanding the limitations we have from the perspective of having dollars to help subsidize affordable housing. But clearly, looking at this category of the market is something, through public feedback, we've understood that's something that our housing policy should address.
One other thing I just wanted to add as a caveat, particularly to the rental supply and demand, is the ACS is an average of several years, and this one, I believe, is 2011 through 2015. We actually got beat up a little bit about this in feedback sessions where people said, "Why are you showing outdated data?" And it was like, well, this is some of the most updated data we have based on census timeframes. But worth considering that, we've seen, particularly on the rental side, some pretty big market increases on a percentage basis over the last 2 years that aren't necessarily showing here yet.
And that may be commercial number 2 for updating our MVA data, because it gets us a little bit closer to the open market.
So other factors under this accessibility, Julie, could you go to the next slide? So evictions is something that we've talked about in the last couple sessions. There's a pretty robust discussion occurring locally with some outside assistance and research into this issue in Kansas City specifically. So this group, the Kansas City Eviction Project, actually put together an updated report with 2017 data, and just pulled in a couple of the charts here that I thought were, so the overall volume of evictions is very steady in Jackson County. It continues to be, certainly a significant number every year. I think they'd averaged out to about 42 per day. I think it's stayed pretty steady, but filings as a result of rent non-payment specifically, so as compared to the other two kind of reasons here, are increasing, which may, over the last couple of years, which may kind of relate to that increase in the market rents.
I can't read the 3 lines. What did the 3 lines say?
That's a good, let me see, look at that. Rent non-payment is the red one. Landlord complaint is the orange one, and unlawful detainer is the green one.
Okay. Okay. I see green, yellow, and I guess that you could call that orange.
Oh, yeah.
What's the top one?
The top one is rent non-payment.
Okay.
So that's the reason for eviction.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the yellow is what now?
The yellow is landlord
complaints?
complaint, and the last one is unlawful detainer.
Okay.
And then in terms of the geography of these filings, I mean, there certainly are some interesting patterns. One thing that they point out in their report is that, the filings aren't necessarily the most concentrated in the very poorest neighborhoods. So there may be areas where there's a little bit more perhaps the most distressed neighborhoods, you don't have quite as much market pressure that's raising rents, whereas in areas that are maybe a little bit more in that mid-market, you're having more of that market pressure. So you can see, kind of some of the areas here. I zoomed in just on anticipation that somebody was going to ask me what these were, but the 2 orange areas kind of in the middle that indicate a higher number of filings are just south of Brush Creek, Swope Parkway, just northwest of Swope Park. And then the like red square straight south from that is kind of Marlboro area.
Do we know whether or not in those areas where there are the clearly identifiable blocks that you just described, whether or not there is a disproportionate amount of real estate owned by a single or small group of owners? Can we say that certain landlords are going to be bigger jerks than others?
Yeah,
I would say, I mean, if you take the millionaire slumlord case, the fellow from California, Rayneth, there's a large concentration of properties probably in the Orange area, just north of the, on the lower level,
The
right-hand
square
side.
right in the middle there?
That one, that area.
Okay.
Go west, go east, east, right there.
Okay,
You'll probably find a large concentration of his properties there. We've actually walked some of his properties with him and his people, and there was a good dozen of them in a concentration area that are vacant and abandoned and been broken into. And some of those are people that, and some of those houses, you've actually had people in that they probably shouldn't be in there because it's unhealthy conditions. And so there is that concentration there, and we've been trying to wrestle those from him if we could. And he, so far, hasn't relented and given up the ownership to those properties yet. But he's only one of, there are those kinds of owners, the LLCs and or out-of-town investors that own a lot of property in a lot of places in what they consider as low-value neighborhoods. And so they buy them in bulk, and their model is to rehab them and to rent them out, but then they find out that they don't have enough money to do all the rehab that needs to be done, and so they sit vacant for a while. And that's a big problem.
and we don't have many tools to deal with that.
Well, we're using our neighborhood preservation tool. I mean, we're kind of like, as they say, white on rice on him right now, on his properties, and we basically have an agreement with him that by a certain date you're going to do these things on these properties, and if not, then we're going to take the next step with you and haul you into court. I mean, we know who he is and we know his local people in terms of the rehab, but that's really the best tool that we have
And
right now.
how often does he actually follow through and do what he says he's gonna do?
He spotty. I mean, he starts off strong, and then it kind of piddles out a little bit. And then we'll have to make the phone call again and up the ante again.
Have we ever thought about doing some sort of like a consent decree type of a deal where he agrees to a punishment in advance, and if he doesn't perform, then the punishment or whatever the situation is automatically takes place? Because it seems to me we're just playing ring around the rosy with this guy and others like him. And if we're seriously concerned about this whole issue of evictions and landlords that aren't taking care of property, I think we got to be a little bit more than, hey, here's phone call number 82 after broken promise number 81. Let's try this again for the 5th year in a row. I mean, at some point, I think we have to start doing something a little bit more.
That's an intriguing idea.
Yeah, I would sign them up.
He's
Yeah.
got, what, 590 properties?
It was
That's
an
around
intriguing
500.
idea.
Tie them up.
It was a lot.
That's an intriguing idea to sick Emily on him and just.
You can say it's actually brilliant.
Brilliant.
Brilliant. I don't want to be undersold.
Undersold, but that's not a bad idea to deal with a yacht like that. I mean, that's kind of an interesting,
Do we have the leverage to do it?
I don't know, it'd be an interesting issue. Could we
Well,
come up on a lot? I bet you could almost take a court action against him, would force him into some sort of an arrangement.
I would certainly, I think if you do that,
Reaching a settlement agreement,
We've been trying to encourage him to donate
that's not a
properties.
bad idea.
yeah, but you know, you've been trying for how long?
Since about 8 months.
And has he donated anything?
That's not his model.
Well, then it's never gonna be. I
May
mean, how
not
long
be.
are we gonna wait? You know, I mean, he's hurting our city.
Right.
Living where?
Right.
Malibu?
Somewhere in California.
Probably Malibu. I can see it now. He's probably got a serious tan and bleached out white hair and wearing chinos and no socks. Driving around in a Lambo.
You have seen us, man.
Well, I hate to stereotype him, but you know how it is, profiling. I'm just gonna profile him. But I think we need to, first of all, if we do something like that, if we can, it sends a message not only to him but to others. And we've been playing patty cake with this stuff for years. And it's time that we step up our game a little bit and get a little more hostile. And if nothing else, they can move to Johnson County and find distressed properties there or something.
In Ohio, I believe, has something a little stronger. They actually can foreclose on liens and take property. I mean, that's something that I would love to see us do.
Let's get Emily and
A law department,
our law department, see if we can't come up with some strategies.
I agree.
Maybe reach out and get some pro bono assistance too.
Where's our law department?
Yeah, we have legal aid.
Got Emily here, but that might not be a
We
bad,
have
maybe
legal
we
aid
can
on
ask some of
contract.
our legal firms in town to give us some ideas, especially in Marlboro, because who's assisting Marlboro? Isn't, Stinson helping Marlboro?
It could be, I'm not sure which is,
So we've got some firms that provide pro bono legal assistance. It might be a way for us to team up and get some horsepower to look, because I think that Raineth has got a concentration of properties in and around the Marlboro area. If you get Stinson working on behalf of the Marlboro Association with the city and support, maybe you come up with an approach that might work.
It's gotta be,
I think you gotta break the,
Yeah,
you
I
gotta
agree.
break the traditional model doesn't work for these guys.
no, it doesn't. Well, they know that nothing's really gonna happen to them.
Right, they can play the long game.
Exactly right.
Right.
But, you know, the thing about it, though, is that if there is a way,
See, could you take
To
a
put
mass
them-
receivership action on him?
Something
That is
like
held
that,
in
yeah.
abeyance as long as he's in full compliance.
exactly, and either he complies with what's needed to be done, or he's no longer there to worry about, at least in those
That would
specific
be,
properties.
that would be an interesting, on a scale like that.
thank you,
I don't know,
We
let's-
shall
let's-
move
let's-
forward.
Let's do a little follow-up with
right.
law, and maybe I'll reach out to Stinson, see if they want to help us. too.
Okay, so you can add that to your infomercial.
Hey, thank you so much.
And if you don't act today, we will.
We will, that's right.
I'm just trying to make sure that you got a post-city career to fall back on.
Post-career, interesting conversation.
Well, it's gonna happen to all of us. Frankly, I'm looking kind of forward to mine.
We're about the same age, too.
Yeah, but it doesn't look like it.
You're right, you're right.
You look so much younger.
I knew where you were going with that.
Now, just pivot a little bit, you know, take the sting out. Okay,
So another way to think about supply and demand is just what our residents think, how satisfied they are. And so this is going back to our resident survey. We just have 2 questions on there about housing, but they're pretty broad. So, overall satisfaction with availability of affordable housing is 57%, 66% satisfaction with quality of housing. But if you go forward to looking at the chart that looks at availability of affordable housing by income, not surprisingly, the lowest income group we have on the survey is
less satisfied.
much less satisfied, 31% dissatisfied with availability, which relates back to all of the other supply and demand charts we've seen and the cost burden. When we look at it by council district, we see, something similar, which is that Council District 3 and 5, which do have concentrations of lower income areas or lower income residents, higher dissatisfaction as well. And then quality shows a similar pattern. 24% of lower income residents dissatisfied with quality. And then again, 3rd district, 5th district, higher levels of dissatisfaction with quality. And again, going back to what residents think, we talked about their support for a housing policy, but we specifically asked about, are you supportive of developing policies and programs within the areas of, investing in rental housing, improving affordability and quality there, and increasing accessibility and opportunity for homeownership. So again, nearly 70% across the board of residents in both those areas, are supportive of investing in those areas. So With that, that takes us to the end of objective 3, or objective 2, I'm sorry. So if there are no questions, we'll go on to objective 3, which does relate to improving conditions, quality, and livability. So, and strategy A under that is to expand the reach of Project Let's Save KC through increased awareness, communication, and testing. I'll turn it over to the health department to talk through this strategy.
Thanks, Amy Roberts, Health Department. On this slide, you can see our goals between 15 and 18, and we came pretty close to our FY19 goal of reaching 5% children with elevated blood lead levels. So we're at 5.1%. Initially, I thought that that was going to be a little higher than it actually turned out to be, so that's a good thing. Number of new cases of lead-poisoned children open for investigation. So these are kids who have seriously elevated blood lead levels. And the update for 2018 is year-to-date. So we would expect, because one of our biggest testing seasons is the fall, that we'll see probably up to a 50% more, up to a doubling of that number. So we may see as many as 28 kids that come under case management for extremely elevated blood lead levels. This slide, again, is an update from a previous presentation, and it shows year-to-date. The percentage of tests that we do at community testing events and then the children that are tested at our health department. And you can see from the numbers that the bulk of our testing is done at community testing events for Head Start and other community events that are outside of the department clinic. And on the right side, you can see these numbers are, they look low, and those are our clinic numbers by month to date. So actually, if we include the kids that we've tested outside of the health department, we've tested a total of 278 children since January. And we run anywhere between like 10 to 80 kids a month that we test out in the community. So this graph only shows what we test in our in-house clinic. And again, we expect those numbers to be higher with our fall back-to-school rush, where we test as many as 400 children a month. This slide is also a review from the last presentation. It talks about our Let's Save KC grant, and we were one of the top scoring grant in the country, and that'll be a 36-month grant for $2.9 million. Our contractor base continues to run around 9 contractors, although we're always trying to get more contractors because that gives us a better bids. And we're looking at completing around 152 properties. We'd like to get a little bit above that, but we'll kind of see how the costs turn out. This graph looks at applications that we've received for this current grant. The start date was December 1st. That's the start of the period of performance. We have 157 applications that are ready to go. We've already started work and completed 15 units, and we have 10 in progress. Some of the other grantees, we were kind of encouraged because our startup took more time than we had thought, but we're actually one of the few grants in the country that has already started completing units. And on the right, on the right you can see the overlay with the high-risk zip codes, the lowest life expectancy zip codes, and where our applications are coming from. So you can kind of see we have applications in the highest risk zip codes, but there are a couple that we could look at increasing our targeting on. And while we are looking at highest risk zip codes in terms of life expectancy, we also are targeting zip codes that have the highest number of children under 6, highest rates of lead poisoning, and highest rates of pre-1978 housing. Units completed for our last grant. This is a point graph The red dots are rental properties, and the blue dots are owner-occupied. In previous grants, we have done quite a few rentals, but in the past 2 grants, we've really seen a lot more owner-occupied grants than rentals. We completed 173 total units, and 35 of those were rentals. And again, you can kind of see on the left those lowest life expectancy zip codes and where those units were done.
Why are there some dots in the white space that was assuming was not Kansas City?
Oh, that's an awesome question. Actually, one of our partners was the City of Independence. So they worked with us as a community development corporation. So we did a number of units in Independence as well.
Okay.
Having partners helps to increase our grant score.
Gotcha.
A few before and after houses from this previous grant. You can kind of gives a little bit of an example of the type of work we do. Mostly painting and window replacement. We do some landscaping. We do healthy homes, things like door replacements and stair repair, handrail repair. So this kind of shows some of that work. Trim repair, we do some vinyl work as well. So, and that's another house that had some trim repair, and this one had vinyl siding, window replacement. This slide looks at some of the mechanisms through which we get our applications. And on the left, that is how we test kids. And our elevated blood lead children or our lead poisoned children come through referrals from people who've already applied for the Lead Safe KC program. We also get referrals through the Head Starts and daycares and children that come in through education or through part of our general surveillance. And they receive education and case management from our health department nurses, and as part of that are funneled into the Lead Safe KC remediation program. Or people in the community on the left find out about the program, and then they can apply. Families who are 80% of the median income, who have at least one child under 6, or a pregnant woman living in the home. So they do not have to be lead poisoned. It's a primary prevention program. So we do repair homes of lead poisoned children, but families do not have to have a lead poisoned child in the home to qualify.
And so this last chart here, again, goes back to the housing survey. One of the questions we asked was, does your home have lead paint within it? And I think the really interesting insight here is that a much larger proportion of people don't know than can say definitively, yes, it does. So, and the when we look at this against income, we can kind of see the disparity here. So citywide, 5% of people say yes, 30% say don't know, 65% say no. But if you compare that to the lowest income, more people don't know than say no. And if you take it all the way up to the highest income group, much larger proportions say no, there is not, versus don't know or yes.
Kate, is this combined rental and home ownership
Yes.
numbers? Okay, so it'd be interesting to split that out and see what the difference is between owners versus renters.
Yeah, and there's I didn't do it via both metric, layering income and renter owner, but basically a slightly higher proportion of renters say don't know, which again you would expect, right? That if you're an owner, you've maybe been there longer or had taken on more knowledge about what's in your house. So.
And a potential confounder as well might be that because there are ramifications to having lead hazards in their house, people might be reluctant to disclose that they know that there's lead paint hazards or that they have a suspicion.
Okay, so strategy B under this objective 3 is to implement a healthy homes inspection program to protect rental property occupants, so environmental hazards. So again, we'll turn it back to Amy to talk about this.
Thanks. So this is an update again from a previous slide, looking at the homes that we are able to respond to that we get Healthy Homes complaints. And Healthy Homes includes things, not including rat, but it or rat complaints, but it does include mold and carbon monoxide and smells, safety issues, and other condition issues. And so in 2017, we were able to visit a few sites, but very few compared to the number of complaints we get. And when we look at unable to respond versus able to respond, we're defining response as a site visit. So anybody who calls with a complaint will get education and information and referrals as we can do that. But people would like for us to be able to come out and look at the issue that they have and do some enforcement, and we're not able to do that right now. And then for 2018, the year to date, we've not been out on any properties with for a Healthy Homes complaint. This is review of where we are with the initiative petition or with the Healthy Homes rental inspection program. Just to review, we proposed the rental housing inspection program, it was heard in the Housing Committee in 2017 and is currently still held in committee. The local stakeholders filed an initiative petition based on the initial proposed ordinance, and the initiative petition question will be on the ballot August 7th.
Okay. I'll talk offline about that because frankly, who knows that? Who knows about this? There's no campaign or anything, is there?
Yeah, I can answer that a little bit. Obviously, once it's on an initiative petition, we can't be talking about how to vote or any of those things. But
Right.
we are aware that, I believe the Healthcare Foundation has funded more squared with a little bit of money to do some activity on this. But we're not, I mean, it's an independent initiative petition, so we're not as aware of that, but certainly would be willing to talk offline on some of this.
Okay, cool.
I think the rental housing registration is.
I was actually going to speak to that one.
Sorry.
It's actually done through, Neighborhood and Housing Services, but we pulled this data from them. So this is really what we have in terms of existing policy in rental housing regulation. It's there's not a lot of enforcement here. It's sort of, I don't want to say it's optional because it's not. It's required, but there's not a lot. There's no resources to pursue a whole lot of enforcement or the type of more in-depth inspections that this is more of just a registration process. But the update on that is that it does require registration by January 31st. So for the current year, 5,300 registrations have been completed, and that represents about 19,000 rental properties. We don't have a really great count of total rental properties, but just kind of looking at the difference between owners and renters in terms of the property data, I think city planning was able to sort of impute that we have approximately 71,000 parcels of rental housing, which is about 46% of our residential parcels. So, you can see that the proportion and roughly the proportion then about quarter, a little more than a quarter that have registered through this voluntary process. So
There is a fine aspect to these rental properties. We have a contract person who has been working on this for about little over a year now, and she's got a lot of great results, as you can see, 5,300, over 5,300 renewals and registrations just in this year alone have occurred, but that's still a percentage of all rental properties that we are aware of. The imprecise nature of how many parcels of rental property is one reason is because there are a lot of single-family properties that we don't know that are rental unless we know that. And then those individuals that we have discovered that actually have rental properties, a lot of them end up taking them offline and try to sell them. So there's a lot of playing of the numbers by owners, even as we go through this registration process. But again, we've gotten a lot of compliance out of this process. There is a fine process involved in this. If the properties are not registered by January 31st, then there is and particularly if we have a letter to them, a 7-day letter requesting that they get registered and they don't register, it's a $200 fine. And for each month that the property is not registered, it's an additional $200 fine added on, plus $50 per month failure to comply. So, and the consequence of that is really an administrative citation for the property owner. And that's the extent of what we can do.
Okay, strategy C, second to last in this section, or in this Casey stat, is to identify funding sources to improve and maximize energy efficiency. So turn it over to Dennis to talk about that.
Dennis Murphy, the Office of Environmental Quality. And if we go to the next slide.
Dennis, before you do that and we move into a different subject, I think might be a time to highlight the Nacho Award there that seems to have brought its own beach towel. I don't know why it's on a beach towel, but whatever. This rather impressive award here from the Beaumont Foundation and Kaiser Permanente for the leadership for advancing policies that promote healthy and thriving city, and a silver medal. I argued for gold, but they wouldn't give it to me. But I do think it's important to highlight the good work of the health department in this regard. So thank you for that. I don't know why this is back on my desk, but I'm giving it back to you.
Okay.
I have more than enough stuff in my office, and I think it rightfully belongs with you guys at the health department. So thanks for the work. Received this in Boston. I suffered a injury carrying it back. And I applied for workers' compensation, and I was turned down. So
Apply as a firefighter, maybe that'll help you.
that's probably more training than I have. But thank you for the effort. I think it's interesting, and once again, I think it's instructive to people who don't have a really good sense of the quality of the people who work for this city, to know that this is a national award. This isn't something that is given out lightly. And it shows, I think, not just that the award itself is that, but I think this is a step up from the last time. And still, of course, the goal is for gold, but we're moving in the right direction and being recognized nationally for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, Mayor, if I can just say the 41 largest cities in the country were part of this process with the De Beaumont Foundation, and there are only 5 cities, all primarily in blue states, because of some of the medal areas for us are actually preempted by the state, so we can't actually get that category accomplished. But we believe that if we can move forward on educational quality, childcare, that'll tip us to gold, so we can join those other 5 cities that are at the gold level and really help our citizens quite a bit. But this is not just an award from the health department. Many of these policies actually started in other departments and are actually led or managed by other departments, so it really is a citywide effort.
How many of your lead cases come through referrals from teachers or elsewhere? For kids, I mean.
By the time they get into the higher grade levels, we've missed most of the opportunity to prevent most of the damage. So where we're getting most of our referrals are from early Head Start, or the various physicians or safety net providers that screen Medicaid folks for lead, or where parents are aware enough that they might be in housing conditions where lead could be a case, so that they actually get their kids screened. That's where they're coming from. We've identified, based on the lack of screening in certain zip codes compared to the prevalence of positives in that zip code, that we've probably still got about 800 kids that are exposed to lead that are now being delayed in their ability to learn and impulse control and all those things, that society then ends up spending huge amounts of money on prisons or other things down the road because we damaged those kids when they were younger. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but we're getting more creative. We now have a mobile van that we're hoping will be getting out into more of these communities and doing more screening activity, et cetera. The other award is we're the first health department in the country to actually get the Local Health Department of the Year award more than once. And this was actually the support of the city manager, other departments on the LifeX process, and the city council supporting us to come together to look at, how do we increase life expectancy, reducing inequities between zip codes, the innovative work that Parks Department and others are doing. And our three core departments of housing and neighborhoods and city planning and health have been meeting together at least every other month for about a year now, of talking about various issues that it's amazing how even when it's our area, sometimes we don't hear about something before another department hears about it, and it comes to the agenda and we are able to get our hands around it. So it's a lot of the things you've been challenging all of us at KC Stat to be collaborating together. We've kind of taken it outside of KC Stat and are working together on these issues.
Good, thank you, and thanks for the work. And when you consider that only about 35% of the city's pre-kindergarten kids are in quality pre-K, if that were to increase, there would be more kids who would be spotted earlier, which is a good byproduct of having kids in pre-K. Okay. I'm sorry, didn't mean to stop you, Dennis, but I thought before we made a break to a different subject matter, we probably ought to take care of the health department.
No, that was fine. So you may recall that there was a slide earlier that was referenced as being used in the public meetings that we've had regarding the housing policy, and that dealt with cost burdens. That looked solely at the rent or the mortgage cost. And often when we're looking at that 30% of total household income threshold, we don't take into account other supporting costs. And one of the most significant is paying the utility bills, and in particular, energy. So this slide that's up now, the energy cost burden in Kansas City, was also presented at the public meetings. And it's based upon information that was published in April of 2016 by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, where they analyzed 48 metropolitan areas. And unfortunately, this is not a top 10 list that Kansas City wants to be on, but we were identified as the 7th highest of the 48 in terms of energy spending as a proportion of household income, the so-called energy burden, which means if you look at it across the metro area, households spend about 4.5% of their household income on energy costs. But as you drill down and look at renter households, the number rises to 6.1% of income, and we are the 6th highest of the 48. And when you look at low-income households, we rank 9th highest with an energy burden that jumps up to 8.5% of income. And when you then delve even further into it and look at the upper quartile of low-income households, the numbers rise to 13 to 15%, particularly in Latino and African-American households. So it's a really significant part of the total burden, and the next slide sort of reflects this. So if you take a look at the impact of the energy cost burden, if you look particularly at that lower row of numbers, the low-income household level, where households are at 80% of the median income level, you see that that if you look at that 30% rule, that allows them reasonably to spend $950 on housing. However, if you look at the 8.5% energy burden, that uses a significant amount of the resources and reduces the amount that's available for rent to only about 21.5%, which means that that household would only be able to spend less than $700 a month on paying their mortgage or rent in this case, as compared to somebody that's at the median income, actually has more money available and lower energy burden, so that they have a substantially higher amount of their household income available for rent. So it's an indication that the problem most heavily impacts the people that are at the lower income levels. They're the most energy burdened. They live, in many cases, in some of the most energy inefficient housing that we have in the community. So if we move to the next slide.
And Dennis, not to interrupt, but just wanted to reemphasize, I think we've talked about this in the past, this study was only focused on energy costs, i.e. gas and electric.
That's
So
right.
it's not inclusive of water, sewer, which are some of our most quickly escalating costs. So, I mean, you start to factor that in. If they're spending 8.5% on just electricity and gas, and then maybe another several percent, I mean, the amount that they have available for rent, if they want to stay not cost burdened, is, really dwindling.
Yeah, good point. So the next slide deals with the clean energy resolution. The last time that we did an update on KC Stat housing, we were still working on the evaluation of the feasibility of several clean energy initiatives. That report was finalized and submitted to you and the City Council, Mr. Mayor, back in late March. We identified that all 10 of the initiatives were feasible, although several of them would require additional resources, especially for actions to make low-income housing more energy efficient. There were a couple of those 10 initiatives that focused directly on lower-income neighborhoods or households. One of them was to develop an initiative to increase energy and water efficiency, solar and electric vehicles in underserved communities. And then another one that dealt specifically with developing a strategy for increasing interest in clean energy financing, including PACE financing, and use of investments at the time of refinancing with an emphasis on low-income multifamily building owners. If you hearken back to the earlier discussion about the number of projects, low-income, subsidized housing projects that are coming at the end of their lives as subsidized projects within the next 5 years, that makes one of the strategies that we identified particularly important, which is looking at whether we can promote PACE financing to the owners of those buildings as a part of the refinancing package when they come up at the expiration of their subsidized financing, whether it's low-income housing tax credits or other support from the city. So that's one of the strategies that we'll be looking at in particular.
Good, thank you.
Next slide. One of the real successes that we've seen in Kansas City in terms of residential energy efficiency improvements has come through the residential PACE program operated by Renovate America, the so-called HERO program, which is offered as a part of the city's participation in the Missouri Clean Energy District PACE program. This was actually featured in a study that was done by the Alliance for Sustainable Futures report that was a partnership between the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the C2ES, which is the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, which published a report and highlighted the PACE program here in Kansas City as one of the programs that was a model for others to emulate. You can see that the program launched in September of 16, so we're a little less than 2 years into it. 1,600 applications have been received, 934 have been approved. 509 of those projects have been completed in individual homes, representing 847 projects. So many of the homeowners chose not only to do energy efficiency, but also renewable energy projects, which are an eligible cost under PACE. The total value of projects completed to date is in excess of $8 million. Over the lifetime of those projects, it ranged up to as long as 20 years, although most of them are substantially shorter in terms of payoff time period. The expected energy savings is over 36 million kilowatt hours of electricity. So it's a substantial amount of energy savings and cost savings, as well as a significant amount of greenhouse gas reduction. So
And Dennis, are those Kansas City numbers or are those?
those are
Missouri?
Kansas City, Missouri
Okay,
numbers. So
fantastic.
they operate,
Statewide?
yeah,
Right.
they are offered statewide. A number of cities have chosen to opt into the Missouri Clean Energy District.
But these
They're-
are just these are just
These
Kansas
are
City.
just Kansas City, Missouri. So
great.
Independence is
Yeah.
a part of Missouri Clean Energy District, as is Lee Summit and some other jurisdictions in our area. But those are just Kansas City, Missouri numbers.
Okay.
And they continue to grow, so that's a good sign. Next slide. One of the things that we have been doing is participating in a statewide conversation over the last 2 years with many other local, state, regional, and national organizations under the rubric of the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance and its low-income working group on how we can strategically provide energy efficiency benefits to residents of low-income housing, whether it's single-family or multifamily. There's actually been a work plan for this group that delineated a number of expected deliverables. You can see them up there, and I won't go into detail on those, but we've actually got a call tomorrow to talk about progress and working with those. The group includes the Missouri Housing Development Commission. It includes PACE providers. It includes energy utilities, so KCP&L and Ameren are a part of this conversation. Spire is a part of this conversation. A number of other entities, the National Housing Trust is a key player in this. And the Energy Efficiency for All initiative is actually, Missouri was one of a handful of states that were chosen to focus on this issue. And the Natural Resources Defense Council actually created the Energy Efficiency for All initiative, and Missouri was one of their targeted states. Also, our low-income weatherization assistance program agencies are also participating in this conversation. So there are a number of initiatives, and we'll keep you apprised as the effort moves forward in 2018. Next. We've also talked previously regarding the opportunity to get mutual benefits to the citizens that we serve with both low-income weatherization programs that are funded by the utilities in the state, that are managed by the Community Action Agency of Greater Kansas City, as well as the city's minor home repair program. So in some cases, in times past, it hasn't proven feasible to do weatherization assistance on homes because they have leaking roofs or other issues that just don't make it a viable project. So we have committed to facilitating a conversation between the LIWAP provider, Community Action Agency of Greater KC, and the staff of our own Neighborhood and Housing Services Department. We've actually got a meeting scheduled for the 30th of this month to figure out ways that we might coordinate those programs to improve the benefits and to identify opportunities for synergism between those two so that minor home repair recipients may not be aware that they might also be eligible for free low-income weatherization assistance. And again, LIWAP participants that might otherwise be rejected might be viable entities if they had some minor home repair assistance. One of the challenges is the funding time periods aren't necessarily in sync, but we'll try to see what we can do to work through that. And John Wood and the folks at Community Action Agency have agreed to sit down and have that conversation. In terms of activities by the Community Action Agency, this is an update to a slide that was provided at our earlier session. You can see that they have targeted in their fiscal year 2017 for 200 home weatherizations. They actually achieved 202. They have actually received supplemental funding from the state because other jurisdictions underutilize low-income weatherization money. And when that happens, agencies that are taking full advantage of it can get supplemental resources. So it's nice to know that we've got an entity that's really making significant progress. And you can see that the kinds of people that are being served by their weatherization activities include significant number of children, elderly, disabled, and veterans. So it's a good target audience that they're working at. They also have a target audience of trying to deal with clients that have issues that deal with plumbing issues, mold, infestation, other things. So they actually work in a program that sort of is a companion to the Healthy Homes work by the health department. So we're very pleased with what we've seen out of the CAA and hope to continue working with them. The last item I'm going to mention is the Bloomberg Philanthropies announced an opportunity for the 100 largest cities in the United States, and this is cities, not metro areas, so it's the city of Kansas City, Missouri, is eligible to submit an application by tomorrow, which we will be doing. The initiative is called the American Cities Climate Challenge. Bloomberg Philanthropies will select 20 of the 100 largest cities to participate in a 2-year program to accelerate climate change policies and actions that focus on energy and transportation, particularly on energy we use in our buildings, as well as looking at transportation in its many dimensions, mass transit, bike ped issues, as well as other things that will reduce the amount of emissions that come from our transportation sector. The selected cities will receive supposedly at least $2 million in technical assistance and services over the 2-year period. It will include a staff person, a climate advisor that would actually be housed in City Hall to work with the selected cities. They will also provide data, design, innovation resources, tools for citizen engagement, polling and communication support, and a variety of other mechanisms. There's no specific commitment to dollars to be given to the city, but one part of the package is a pool of resources. We don't know how much it would be for so-called rapid response grants. So if during that 2-year period we identify something that a modest amount of funding might help us move forward, we could actually apply for that sort of funding as well. The process is that once the applications are submitted by tomorrow, they will go through a process to shortlist a number of cities, probably in the 30 to 35 city range. They will actually do site visits to each of those 35 cities. And then NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, which is the technical lead with Bloomberg Philanthropies on this project, will actually work with the shortlisted cities to develop a specific, detailed 2-year work plan that would be submitted for final consideration. 20 cities will be selected in the fall, and then they will work with the individual cities on entering into agreements for the 2-year project period that is anticipated to run through calendar years 2019 and 2020.
How you feel about our application?
I feel really good about it right now. We've got letters of support, I would say excellent letters of support from Evergy. I still struggle with that. Evergy, which is the new merged KCP&L and Westar, or Great Plains Energy, that was actually signed by Terry Bassam, President and CEO of the new merged utilities. They made an excellent case for the fact that their business plan aligns with the city's work on climate change, and they're committed to continuing to work with us on renewable energy and energy efficiency. We also have a joint letter signed by David Warm from Mid-America Regional Council and the Deputy CEO of Kansas City Area Transportation Authority, so we have a strong letter of support from people that have been working on the transportation side. And then the third letter is from Joanne Collins, who chairs the city's Climate Protection Steering Committee, which gave us an opportunity for her to sort of tell the story about how we've gotten to where we are, working in collaboration with other people across the entire metropolitan area. So I'm feeling really good about our prospects.
Good. Okay.
I have no doubt that we will make the short list. The competition to make the final 20 is going to be pretty fierce. There are a number of cities in the Midwest that are expected to apply, including St. Louis, Minneapolis, Indianapolis, St. Paul. So in addition to the cities on the coast that'll be interested, I think there'll be a lot of competition in the heartland of the U.S., but I think we're in position, I think, to fare very well in the competition.
Good. Thanks for the work that you've done in order to put us in that position, Dennis.
You're very welcome.
Okay, that brings us to our last strategy under the housing goal, which is to utilize the city's transit-oriented development policy. And turn it over to City Planning and Development to talk about that.
And I'll pick up on Dennis's theme about mass transit and transit-oriented development. Is really looking at taking advantage of those corridors where we have high-quality or high-frequency transit and looking at opportunities to encourage dense and compact development. We passed a TOD policy in May of last year, and it's really great, and I appreciate everybody's efforts to get us there because that really is a good foundation as we pursue other federal funding, not only for BRT, but for light rail, other types of transit investments. But from the perspective of housing and looking at housing, the TOD policy puts in place the ability to create what they call station area plans. You know, what's the environment like around the quarter-mile walk circle, so 1,500 feet from any point of high-frequency transit. And it allows for individual station plans to be crafted and take a look at types of uses within the area, encouraging mixed-use buildings, so ground floor, commercial, residential above, considering percentages of affordability in any type of housing we would encourage on the corridor. It's really also important for TOD. Lots of the feedback we've gotten as we've worked along transit corridors is that people in neighborhoods adjacent to these corridors want to be able to walk to goods and services, lots of different options, and really would like to see the higher density residential developments along the corridors to help kind of preserve more of their single and lower density development patterns happening within neighborhoods. So if we go to the next slide, it will show what we're talking about as it relates to current household density and transit lines. You're seeing Main Street, Max in the pink and Troost in the yellow, and soon to be Prospect Max in blue. The map's talking about households per acreage. Clearly on that map, we're looking to see that those household densities, more than 10 per acre, are occurring along those transit corridors, really making sure that as many people as possible have access to high-frequency transit that would allow them to move between work and home, home and recreational opportunities, educational opportunities. So this framework allows for us to build some policy strategies that enhance what we've already done with area planning, but really focus in on transit corridor and taking advantage of those transit investments. Just two things to highlight as it talks to about transit and upcoming things happening with Prospect Max. We know construction should be starting before the end of the year overall. Yep, we did do mobility hubs. Sorry, it's okay. We'll do TOD and mobility hubs. So a mobility hub is just a location where you don't have access not only to your high-frequency transit, but any other types of transit opportunities as well. So whether it be bike share or other types of things. And again, those are being points where we look at doing higher density development that's happening there. The ATA right now has put out an RFP, has one out, and thinking of 2 responses back for them to do development on property that they have right along 18th Street and Troost. And so the hope there is that can become a demonstration about higher density development near a transit-rich environment. And then we also see that project as really being linkages between the activity centers of the East Crossroads and what's happening at 18th and Vine. The other thought about mobility hubs is what happens kind of at the end of the line and what opportunities there are for the end of transit corridors and looking at providing additional vehicle services, rideshare services opportunities, but also development opportunities. as we look to do more build out of TOD and our BRT, looking at those stops and seeing what services, even community-oriented services we can offer. It's been a model that ATA has pursued before, daycare centers, YMCA's, other things at these transit nodes. So that's how TOD and mobility hubs come together. One more, and I don't think I'm here for this one, but again, what's happening specifically on lines. So the bids have been open for 12th and Grand construction improvements. So those are making stop improvements, shelter improvements at 12th and Grand based upon the realignment of the Main Street Max off of Main Street and onto Grand Boulevard. Independence Avenue is another corridor that is coming into effect very soon as well. And that is where we're just doing the study right now to take a look at all of the different options related to creating a Max line bus rapid transit from our downtown all the way across Independence Avenue into Independence itself. Again, there it's looking right now at understanding the right-of-way and what options we have for BRT, bike lanes, sidewalk improvements, but also making sure we have a lot of the framework for development in place, which we have in Independence Avenue between Boulevard and Parkway standards. We have a design, development overlay that happens there. We have several historic districts there. So the study of the MAX will really give a very complete understanding about what needs to happen in terms of taking the best advantage of transit service we'll be providing, and also knowing that we've provided the framework and the policy guidance for dense, compact development along the Independence Avenue corridor. So that's where we stand today in terms of putting together transit service and transit development opportunities.
All of our major arteries of transit are north and south.
They are.
That creates an inequitable situation, in my opinion.
And one of the things in studies in the past, we've looked at looking at east-west corridors, albeit 31st Street, Linwood Boulevard. Independence Avenue begins to get us to start looking at east-west. But clearly the next emphasis on doing those east-west connections, because anybody who's taken the MAX along Main Street or in Troost knows those stops, 39th Street in particular, where a lot of people get off. They're trying to make those east-west connections, and they just don't have the same robust level of transit service doing the east-west.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't have any additional questions. Do you have any?
Nope. I think we're good.
What's for lunch?
Mine's in the fridge upstairs. Mine's in the fridge upstairs.
You mean ours?
Always happy to share.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Good stuff. I hope we'll follow up on the modified consent decree approach. It's actually, I think, in legal terms, at least when I was practicing shortly after the Revolutionary War, a consent judgment. You know, you get the judgment and forbear the leverage unless you need it, if you go through a process, but you can always do it by agreement.
Intriguing idea, that might work, yeah.
Something,
Especially for those large property owners like him, who's just.
yeah, that are just kind of, running neighborhoods by being absentee.
Yeah, we'll work on that one, that's got some value.
Okay. Thanks a lot, folks.
Thanks,
Appreciate-
everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate the effort.